Welcome to World Revolution Channel. Today, we present a summary of the book The Snowball by Alice Schroeder. This book chronicles the life of Warren Buffett, from his childhood fascination with numbers in Omaha to his rise as a legendary global investor. It details his formative years during the Great Depression, his education under Ben Graham, and the founding of Berkshire Hathaway. Beyond his financial brilliance, the story highlights his complex personal dynamics, including his unconventional marriage to Susie Buffett and his deep friendship with Katharine Graham. It also examines his leadership during corporate crises, such as the Salomon brothers scandal, and his disciplined adherence to the principle of margin of safety. Let's dive in. That introduction alone, it just shows the massive scope of this story. We're talking about a life that spans almost a century of American economic history,
Right.
weaving together this personal eccentricity with, global financial dominance. But for this deep dive, we're really going to focus on two essential, interconnected pressure points that define him. First, we have to talk about the bubble of the late 90s. This is where his famous contrarianism was put to the absolute test, and where he was, let's be honest, he was openly ridiculed for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, we're going to rewind all the way back to the inner scorecard. These are the deep, often anxious, and intensely competitive childhood roots that explain exactly why he was able to stand alone against the madness of that bubble.
It's the perfect approach. It really is. We aren't here to just recite a list of his successful trades. That's been done. We're trying to decode the man.
Exactly.
This dive is all about understanding those foundational elements, the personality quirks, the economic environment he grew up in, and the philosophical turning points that really forged the world's greatest investor.
Right.
For anyone trying to get a handle on what makes him tick, you absolutely have to connect those early traumas and those rigid principles directly to the massive and often very lonely decisions he made later in life.
You have to see how the 4-year-old dealing with the Dust Bowl became the 70-year-old who was just completely resisting the lure of the Dotcom boom.
That's the whole story right there.
Okay, so let's unpack what the source calls the less flattering version of his contrarianism. We'll set the scene against, one of the most absurd concentrations of wealth in history. Sun Valley, Idaho, July 1999.
The setting of this Allen & Co. conference it's just so critical to understand. It was the ultimate elephant bumping event.
Elephant bumping, I like that.
It's what they called it. It was this sort of self-congratulatory festival of the hyper-elite. And the invitation list was so coveted that just getting one was an implicit reassurance to attendees that they, too, were an elephant in the global economy.
And the experience itself was designed to maximize that feeling of belonging, right? Describe the lavish scene, because it sets up the contrast with Buffett perfectly.
Oh, it was high-altitude, faux, rustic capitalism. Guests arrived and were immediately immersed in this lavish, very carefully curated Western theme.
So everyone's playing cowboy.
Everyone's playing cowboy. They put on this required Western gear. Sometimes they'd even arrive in old-fashioned horse-drawn wagons to the Trail Creek Cabin Meadow. The whole atmosphere was just designed to foster this sense of collegial, almost faux democratic exclusivity.
Democratic, yeah.
You had buffets piled with the best steaks and salmon, and the world's most powerful people are all bonding around these huge bonfires beneath the star-dappled western sky. It was engineered for deal-making and really for affirming status.
And into this scene walks Warren Buffett, who, you could argue had the most earned wealth there. And he was just a glaring anomaly, the only one who seemed to be actively subverting the whole spectacle.
That's exactly right. He just embodies the creature of habit part of the book.
Yep.
He drove himself to the Omaha airport in his humble Lincoln Town car.
Of course he did.
And when he got to the airport, he carried his own suitcase onto this gleaming white Gulfstream 5E jet. And you have to understand, this wasn't just any jet. In 1999, it was the largest private aircraft in the world. And new pilots were just consistently shocked by this utter lack of pretense or entourage. He was just so visibly disconnected from the spectacle of wealth that he himself represented.
The detail about the flight is so telling. The source notes that he'd just greet the flight attendant, head to a window seat, and then not even glance out the window for the entire flight. He was already somewhere else, mentally, rooted firmly in Omaha, not in the ostentatious luxury that was defining the tech elite gathering in Sun Valley.
His focus was completely internal. It reflects that inner scorecard that we're going to talk about later, but this internal consistency was clashing violently with the external reality of 1999.
Oh, yeah.
This was the intoxicating peak of the tech mania. The Dow had burst the 10,000-point barrier just 4 months before. It had doubled in under 3.5 years. People genuinely believed that the fundamental laws of finance had just been suspended.
The air was thick with optimism and, frankly, vaporous valuations, as you said.
Yeah.
What was the central narrative that they were all promoting at the conference to justify the madness?
The executives were all promoting this narrative of historical inevitability. The panel on the internet in our lives had people like Priceline's Jay Walker drum-majoring these presentations, comparing the new information superhighway to fundamental shifts of the past, like the advent of the railroad back in 1869.
So this time it's different.
The classic line. And the recently enriched, they're all gathered at the Duck Pond Dining Terrace, swarming around people like Bill Gates and Andy Grove, amplifying this atmosphere of infinite possibility and, inflated self-importance. They thought they were the architects of a new permanent economy.
So into this party walks Buffett, the musty old accountant, trying to bring some Grahamite reality to the situation. And this is the moment the book titles Warren, What's Wrong? Because he delivered this warning that was met with just open resistance and annoyance.
His speech was a classic Buffett takedown. It relied on irrefutable arithmetic, but it landed with a complete thud. He was essentially preaching Ben Graham's caution to a room full of people who thought Graham was ancient history, a footnote.
So he starts with that famous airline anecdote.
Right. He notes the aggregate of all stock investments in the airline industry throughout all of history had made, and I quote, zero money.
The punchline, of course, being that he wished he'd been at Kitty Hawk to shoot Orville down for future capitalists.
Right. And you can imagine this polite, maybe nervous ripple of laughter, but the crowd was definitely not with him. They wanted to hear about new paradigms, not stories about old airplanes.
They absolutely did not, because his argument was directly challenging the whole premise of the new economy.
Exactly. The idea that profits no longer mattered. Only eyeballs and potential mattered. And Buffett just counters with this simple yet shocking valuation gap that just summarizes the whole bubble.
Which was?
How much should you rationally pay for an established, profitable business versus a new business that's losing hundreds of millions?
Give us the specifics of that comparison, because it's just a brilliant example of a market that had completely lost its mind.
Okay, so he compared Toys R Us, which was earning a substantial $400 million a year on $11 billion in sales, stable market share, real inventory.
Real business.
A real business. Then he compared it to eToys, a company losing a massive $123 million annually on just $100 million in sales, a tiny fraction of the revenue.
And
yet, because of the market euphoria, eToys commanded a market capitalization that dwarfed Toys R Us. The message was just inescapable. The market had completely lost its financial moorings and had entered the realm of pure fantasy.
And this leads to the infamous virgin analogy, which was meant to be this humorous yet cutting insult.
Yeah.
But it backfired spectacularly.
It was a profound misjudgment of the ego in that room. He showed a cartoon from the legendary book Where Are the Customers' Yachts?, a book written to mock the hubris of the 1929 era.
Right.
And the caption on the cartoon was, "There are certain things that cannot be adequately explained to a virgin either by words or pictures."
Oof. The intended meaning was clear. The people buying internet stocks were financially inexperienced, and they were about to get screwed by the reality of valuation.
Exactly. But the insult was taken personally and on a deeper social level. He wasn't just calling them financially inexperienced. He was questioning their sophistication, their standing. The reaction, as the source recounts, was just stony silence. Nobody laughed.
Wow.
They did not appreciate being called financial virgins, and they certainly didn't appreciate the implication that the old guard like Buffett held some secret knowledge they didn't.
So he had to pivot, right? He had to resort to a completely different kind of humor to break the tension.
He did. He pivoted quickly to something physical and, frankly, crude. He gave everyone a jeweler's loop and suggested they use it to look at one another's wives' rings, specifically the third wives. And that final biting remark about the transactional nature of their wealth, that finally drew a laugh. It worked, but it just highlights the sheer solitude of true contrarianism in that environment. He had to resort to personal insult just to get them to acknowledge him because they weren't listening to the math.
The lesson there is fascinating. Conviction is necessary, but sometimes it makes you a pariah. He was sitting on the sinking platform of an unloved stock, Berkshire, watching all the TNT Telecom and tech stocks just ascend, with his conviction being tested daily. Yet his inner scorecard just kept him rigidly anchored to value.
That anchor is so crucial. And before we move on to the roots of that anchor, we have to touch on the creatures of habit context of his personal life, because even this business trip was complicated by his very unique domestic arrangement.
Right. He traveled with his wife, Susan, or Susie, who, as the source details, actually lived apart from him in San Francisco.
Yes.
But she still fulfilled the role of the official spouse at Sun Valley and even performed old-fashioned standards at the pool party.
It's an arrangement that just speaks volumes about his need for stable yet highly personalized order. Susie was often the star of that pool party, singing standards by the light of tiki torches. And this dual existence, this man of simple, rigid financial habits, living an extremely complicated, unconventional family life, it always ran parallel to his high-stakes financial world.
So his stability really came from his internal financial convictions.
Absolutely, because his external social and family life was anything but conventional or easily defined.
Okay, so now we move to the origin story, tracing that anchoring conviction all the way back to his childhood and how economic trauma and parental expectations forged his internal motivation. This is the inner scorecard.
You have to understand the sheer psychological weight of the environment he was born into. Warren Edward Buffett arrived on August 30th, 1930, just 10 months after the 1929 market crash.
The very beginning of the Great Depression, the shadow of the crash.
And his father, Howard Buffett, struggled immensely as a stockbroker.
The source gives such a specific, poignant detail about that struggle. It says it was 4 months until Howard made his next stock sale, and his first commission was only $5.
$5.
$5 during the worst economic downturn in modern history.
That staggering context, the near zero-sum reality of life, it deeply ingrained the sense of fierce conservatism and caution. I mean, amid bankruptcies, suicides, financial ruin, his mother, Layla, used to go out with Howard at night and just wait outside on the streetcar so he wouldn't be depressed coming home after calling on a failed client.
Wow.
That shared hardship wasn't just a historical event for him. It was a daily lesson in risk and scarcity.
And it wasn't just the market. Then came the environmental catastrophe, the Dust Bowl. The source details the dust storm years, starting in 1934.
On Warren's 4th birthday, that physical trauma just manifested right on his doorstep. A massive cloud of ruddy literally soil from the Great Plains, buried the front porch of their house.
Unbelievable.
The wind was so fierce, it blew the paper plates right off the party table. The heat was oppressive. It reached 118 degrees, forcing people to sleep outside. This confluence of economic collapse and environmental disaster deeply ingrained the idea that stability is fragile and the world is unpredictable unless it is rigorously controlled.
And this is the seed of the margin of safety.
It has to be.
This brings us to the core of his personality development, the contrasting influence of his parents, which gave him this philosophical choice between the outer and the inner scorecards. Let's look at his mother, Layla the Cyclone.
Layla was a study in external anxiety. She was full of energy, constantly talking and moving, but she was deeply anxious about social class and, critically, what the neighbors would think.
Right.
Warren later crystallized this fixation as the outer scorecard, measuring your self-worth solely by the esteem of others. She was always worrying about appearance, constantly nagging her daughters, particularly Doris, to maintain the right social veneer.
And her rages were intense, weren't they? The book describes them as fierce, almost cyclonic, and particularly directed at the more rebellious Doris.
Yes. The source notes this painful paradox. The prettier Doris got, the worse Layla's tirades were. It sounds like just an emotionally volatile and controlling environment centered entirely around external validation and social performance.
So Warren, the sensitive middle child, was always walking on eggshells.
He was, and he learned quickly that the world of human interaction was messy, volatile, and required constant, exhausting monitoring.
Which makes his father, Howard, the perfect counterpoint and, the sorts of the inner scorecard. Howard was the preacher.
Howard was the anchor of principle. He was rigorously idealistic, fiercely individualistic, and deeply revulsed by rank and privilege that was acquired by birth. He carried a worn piece of paper in his wallet that said, "Why then should I be afraid of anything?"
Wow.
And this gave him this intellectual and moral backbone against the chaos of the Depression. He was sweet and subtly witty despite his fire-breathing rhetoric, which often revolved around politics.
And that rigidity was really tested when he was elected to Congress. He was out campaigning in the stockyards, which were a massive Democratic stronghold, and he had to stick to his principles.
Exactly. You see the urge to preach in action. He was politely pressing these leaflets that shrieked that FDR was the greatest danger to democracy, even though the workers he was talking to viewed FDR as their economic savior.
That takes some nerve.
He stuck to his anti-government principles even when the political cost was massive. Later, he suffered what the source calls political suicide when he broke with his own party by refusing to endorse Eisenhower. He was actually booed at a hometown baseball game for his principles.
So those political struggles branded these three principles into young Warren. That allies are essential because Howard lost so many. Commitments must be sacred and rare because Howard sacrificed everything for them, and that grandstanding rarely gets anything done. That is the foundational bedrock of the inner scorecard. Doing what you know is right, regardless of what anyone else thinks.
It's a remarkable parallel. The volatility of his mother and the rigidity of his father created the situation where Warren channeled all his anxiety and competitive drive away from volatile social expression and directly into the controllable world of numbers and money-making.
And that channeling manifested in these amazing childhood obsessions, starting with the sheer competitive drive detailed in the bathtub steeplechase.
By age 6, his entire world revolved around measurable outputs. He desperately wanted a stopwatch to quantify time in seconds. His competitive drive started small, measuring things like the time it took for a toy boat to complete the bathtub steeplechase.
Right.
But it progressed rapidly. You think about the Bolo anecdote. He alone remained on stage at the Benson Theater, still hitting the ball long after all the other kids quit. It just shows this relentless, self-contained drive. He's competing against himself, not just the other children.
Then the family moves to D.C. after Howard was elected, and Warren was miserable. He lost his whole niche, ping pong, Boy Scouts, his established routines, and he channeled that displacement and anger directly into business, which the source calls inky fingers.
Moving to D.C. was a profound disruption for him, but it unlocked the entrepreneur. He got 3 newspaper routes, and he pulled off a serious business coup by getting the Westchester route, which was normally managed by an adult.
And he became a master of efficiency. The source highlights how he transformed that repetitive job into a self-competition, just maximizing profit per unit of effort.
He was obsessive. He didn't just fold papers, he classified them. He folded them into pancakes or biscuits, specifically designed shapes for ease of throwing. He'd smack them against his thigh to twist them for the most efficient, aerodynamic toss.
He's optimizing his delivery system.
He is, and he was never timid when money was involved. He was knocking on Mrs. Hobby's door at 6 a.m. sharp to collect payment before she had a chance to, escape or avoid the bill. The cash was tangible evidence of his competence in a world that otherwise made him feel highly insecure.
And this desire for certainty and control led him to learn the hard way through 1,000 ways, specifically from his grandfather, Ernest Buffett, at the grocery store.
Ernest was a severe taskmaster, a figure of perfectionism and absolute commitment to customer service. And 2 lessons from that store really stuck with him. First, the famous broccoli battle.
Yes.
Young Warren despised all green food except for money, and he sat at the dinner table for 2 hours until he finished his vegetables, which showed him the power of an immovable will, an early lesson in sticking to a difficult decision.
But the crucial financial lesson came from being burned by his grandfather on a small deal.
Yes, getting burned on a split commission taught him the essential lesson for any future contract negotiator. Know what the deal is in advance, get the contract right, don't rely on implicit trust, rely on explicit, documented structure.
Which reinforces the idea that rationality and clarity must always override emotion or assumed goodwill.
Always. And while he was hyper-focused on legitimate business, he was also dabbling in the fringes of legality. He was hanging out with characters in D.C. and learning true crime stories.
Right.
He and his friends learned these small-time scams, like how to empty a coin-operated soda machine just by pulling the plug lessons and exploiting loopholes and weaknesses. But they quickly moved to more ambitious, consistent business ventures.
Pinball machine.
They found a literal gold mine running pinball machines in barbershops. They called the one near Griffith Stadium the home run of all time because of the reliable, immediate cash flow.
And then there's the bizarre-sounding bookmaking operation and the policy racket involvement. You need to explain that one for our listeners.
So he ran a small bookmaking operation for things like the Preakness, but he strictly favored the 15% take with no risk. He was always structuring the deal so the downside was limited, a concept he'd apply to investments decades later.
And the policy racket.
That was essentially the Washington numbers game, a precursor to the modern lottery, run illegally. The winning numbers were often based on published totals, like the number of births at a local hospital. Warren's role was collecting babies' birth times and rates from the obstetrics ward for use in the racket.
Wow.
He was always looking for the angle, the margin, and the efficient way to structure cash flow with minimal personal exposure.
This intense, all-consuming focus on money and quantifiable control seems inextricably linked to his deep social isolation and insecurity, which the source explores in Pledgy She Was Not and Silent Sales.
He was, by all accounts, highly anxious and socially awkward. He was terrified of public speaking and social situations. He admitted his self-defeating attitude towards dating was, why would they want to go out with me?
That's heartbreaking.
This intense self-consciousness and shaky inner core outside of the realm of finance resulted in very few dates and frequent embarrassment. The anecdote of hitting a cow with his car on a date with Jackie Gillian just highlights his sheer awkwardness in unpredictable social situations.
And the bizarre obsession with Abby Pudgy Stockton perfectly captures this complex search for disciplined perfection.
Pudgy Stockton was the foremost female physical culturist at Muscle Beach. She was a tiny woman, 5'1", 115 pounds, who could lift a grown man without sacrificing her femininity. Warren and his friend Lou were obsessed with her.
Why her?
She represented something powerful yet aesthetically controlled, a work of art achieved through sheer discipline, structure, and effort. It was a tangible ideal that contrasted sharply with his own perceived lack of control in social settings.
It was this intense social fear, this stage fright, that led to his eventual cure, the Dale Carnegie course, which the source lists as stage fright.
He discovered Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People surprisingly early, maybe at age 8 or 9. He found the idea of a systematic approach to people riveting. Rule number 1, don't criticize, condemn, or complain, was particularly impactful.
Why that one?
Because he felt criticism was something he knew everything about, having grown up in the shadow of his mother's emotional volatility. It provided a rational, controlled framework to navigate the unpredictable landscape of human interaction.
But the real commitment came when he was older and ready to confront his most debilitating fear.
Yes. Later, as an adult, he took a public speaking course, and he paid for it with a $100 check, a significant sum at the time. He did this because the terror of speaking was so intense he felt he would throw up.
Wow.
He realized that financial brilliance was useless if he couldn't communicate his ideas, sell his vision, and influence people. He was willing to invest money and mental energy to conquer his greatest fears, recognizing that communication was the essential missing piece to his financial and social ascent.
Let's pivot now to the academic path, which started with some fumbles. Before finding Ben Graham, he was an academic prodigy, but not necessarily a great student in the conventional sense. At Wharton, he was showing off his brilliance in these obnoxious feats of memory, correcting teachers on their text citations and turning in an accounting exam paper instantly.
It was intellectual arrogance, and it was masking profound insecurity. He was flaunting his prodigy status, but failing to demonstrate the maturity or, the roundedness expected of a future business leader. And this came to a head at his Harvard Business School interview, which the source titles The Interview.
And he was rejected. The interviewer famously saw past his confidence as a prodigy in a single subject straight through to his self-consciousness, his shaky inner core.
Harvard was looking for leaders. They saw a brilliant but emotionally immature man who looked about 16 and felt emotionally like he was 12. But that rejection, that strike one, became his greatest stroke of luck.
How so?
It forced him away from the conventional path and toward his destiny.
And that destiny was reading the Columbia catalog and finding his Mount Everest, Ben Graham, and David Dodd.
Reading that catalog and finding his favorite author, Ben Graham, lecturing there it was fate. Graham and Dodd's security analysis, published in 1934, pioneered the entire concept of value investing. For Warren, encountering Graham's method was like a sudden emergence from a cave.
Right.
Realizing that the world, even the stock market, was understandable and rational if you just applied the right metrics.
This is where we get to the core principle that anchored his career, the margin of safety. Let's explore this concept in detail, and let's link it back to the trauma of the Depression.
The margin of safety is not just an accounting principle. For Buffett, it was a psychological defense mechanism. The core realization is that stocks often trade at odds with their intrinsic value for long periods because of irrational market behavior.
So you have to protect yourself from that.
Exactly. Therefore, you must buy a stock so cheaply that you have plenty of room for error. If the market moves against you, if management screws up, if the economy dips, you still don't lose your capital.
It's risk mitigation born directly from the trauma of watching his father struggle during the Depression and the sheer unpredictability of the Dust Bowl. If everything can collapse overnight, you have to structure your investments so they can survive the absolute worst-case scenario.
Precisely. And while for some of his classmates, applying Graham's stringent formulas was a dreary homework assignment, for Warren, it was a fascinating, all-consuming treasure hunt.
Right.
It combined the competitive rigor of numbers with the necessary caution that was instilled by scarcity. You never trust the market completely. You always build a safety net against human irrationality.
And he immediately started putting theory into practice. Working at Graham Newman, he executed the famous Rockwood arbitrage. This shows how quickly he moved from classroom theory to aggressive, real-world maneuvering.
He wasn't afraid to go beyond the simple application of the formula. Rockwood & Co. was selling off its cocoa butter business. The deal was designed to offer shareholders cash for their stock. But Warren, ever the accountant, calculated that shareholders who didn't turn in their shares would end up owning stock that was worth even more cocoa beans per share.
Because of the leftovers.
Because the leftover assets, the extra beans, would bump the value of the remaining shares even higher in the liquidation process.
So he spotted an inefficiency in the fine print that others missed, essentially capitalizing on the apathy of his fellow shareholders.
He bought 222 shares for himself. It illustrates that he wasn't just performing Graham's arbitrage model. He was actively exploiting the complex mechanics of market inefficiency to create value where others saw only a simple transaction.
He was using his numerical acumen for tactical advantage.
Always.
The next great example of this is the Sanborn map battle. This was his major proxy fight that forced management's hand and perfectly illustrated the concept of finding a cigar butt.
Sanborn Map Company was an old, established business that made these detailed fire insurance maps. But by the 1950s, the map business was essentially dead.
Okay.
The stock's value was not in the maps. It was in the portfolio of government bonds and other investments the company had amassed over decades. It was a completely unappreciated asset base. The stock was trading for far, far less than its liquidation value.
So he essentially became an activist investor, but operating entirely within the Grahamite framework.
Yes. By painstakingly assembling enough votes from other shareholders who believed, as he did, that management was just hoarding valuable assets, he forced the company to distribute the equivalent of $110 per share in cash and stock.
Wow.
This was a pure execution of Graham's methodology, finding assets trading for less than their liquidation value and aggressively forcing the realization of that value for the benefit of all shareholders. This was his first major public victory, proving the viability of his system.
This success gave him the conviction for a truly bold and isolating move, the partnership leap. In 1956, he started Buffett Associates Ltd. And chose to move back to Omaha.
This choice leaving Wall Street was a radical statement. At the time, no serious American money man worked anywhere but New York City. Leaving was a profound and venturesome stroke. He was rejecting the cultural center of finance.
Why Omaha? Was it just nostalgia, or was it a strategic choice to reinforce his inner scorecard?
It was absolute strategy and self-preservation. He wanted no boss, he could invest from his house, and most importantly, he could invite only 7 initial partners, including Doc Thompson and his Aunt Alice, who were friends and relatives he implicitly trusted.
So he was controlling the environment.
He was mitigating the risk of external criticism if stocks went down. He was building his own self-contained, rational investment world, completely sheltered to the emotional volatility and corruption he associated with Wall Street.
The final, fascinating outcome of finding his professional footing was the sudden appearance of the teaching urge. Despite the stage fright that terrified him into taking the Dale Carnegie course, he immediately began teaching investment analysis for men only.
And later for women.
At the University of Omaha.
The transformation was remarkable. The terrified boy had vanished. In his place was a still awkward young man, but one who was now an undeniable expert. The source describes him looking like a youngish preacher from some missionary sect. constantly exhorting the students and spouting an inexhaustible series of facts and figures.
So the fear was gone.
The fear of public speaking was overcome entirely by his mastery of the subject. It allowed him to communicate his deep convictions with this boundless, infectious enthusiasm. He had found his controllable arena for performance.
So if the financial world became his refuge of rationality and control, the personal sphere remained messy and fraught with self-doubt. Let's look at how this played out, starting with the Miss Nebraska diversion and his awkward attempts at dating.
After he went off to Columbia, he developed a crush on Vanita Mae Brown, who was Miss Nebraska in 1949 and was performing with Eddie Fisher in New York. The fact that she was a beauty queen and singer placed her firmly in the realm of the outer scorecard, the type of social validation his mother craved.
Right.
He telephoned her and they went on dates, but he was painfully aware of his woefully lacking social skills.
And he kept seeing her even though she hated cheese sandwiches and was, frankly, kind of unkind to him.
She seemed to actively enjoy seeking to embarrass him, which just reinforced his belief that he was socially inadequate. This constant reinforcement of his failures drove him further toward the systematization of interaction, pushing him toward the Dale Carnegie course.
Okay.
He finally ended it when he realized she preferred acting that way, embarrassing him, which suggested she sought to control the dynamic by undermining his confidence.
The real profound turning point was meeting Susie Thompson. He had to pursue her aggressively, despite her initially being in love with somebody else.
He fell hard. He saw her as immensely sophisticated, even authoritative, the complete opposite of his socially paralyzed self. She represented the control and ease in the social world that he lacked. He recognized that she had a strength he desperately needed.
And Susie, in turn, recognized his profound vulnerability.
She saw past the prodigious intellect straight to the man riddled with self-doubt outside of his business realm. She became the emotional scaffolding, the sprinkling can, who patiently worked to bolster his confidence, teaching him about people and making sure his flowers grew.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
It was the emotional security his mother had never offered, a security based on unconditional acceptance, not performance.
And she was also quite firm in ensuring he balanced his obsession with his family life, particularly with their children.
Absolutely. She made sure he bonded with their daughter, little Susie, by insisting he sing to her every night. She was the one who balanced his obsessive financial focus with essential human connection.
And their life in Omaha was an extension of that.
Exactly. The whole partnership model he created in Omaha investing from home was also an accommodation to his reclusive personality. Their social life was subdued, and he often fled small talk to go upstairs to work, focusing solely on making money, not on reading Proust, as the source Riley suggests.
But this eventually led to the breakdown of their conventional arrangement. Susie created a separate life for herself within her marriage as a way to accommodate Warren's obsessions.
She found fulfillment in community work, anti-war protests, and civil rights activities completely separate from his finance-dominated life. Then, around 1977, his growing and deep friendship with Katharine Graham began to push Susie off stage.
Right.
Susie felt she needed freedom and identity outside of simply taking care of the financial genius.
And when she decided to move to San Francisco, telling him, we both have needs, he was completely devastated. The man who controlled global markets lost control of his emotional life.
He was genuinely shocked. The source describes him just wandering aimlessly, calling her every day, weeping and suffering from debilitating headaches. It revealed the depth of his dependence on her emotional support system.
He was lost.
He was, frankly, incapable of basic survival without her scaffolding, barely able to feed and clothe himself. It's a tragic realization of the cost of his single-minded obsession.
This emotional void led to the arrival of Astrid Manx and the creation of the completely unique second partnership.
Astrid was 16 years younger, blue-collar, and brought a dramatically different approach. She had a knowledge of hot cuisine and fine wines, things Warren actively avoided, but her core personality was focused on home life and frugality.
And the contrast is significant.
Yeah.
Astrid was incredibly parsimonious, making Buffett, the supposed frugality guru, look like a wastrel.
Her blunt wit and focus on being a homebody contrasted sharply with the social activism of Susie and the patrician refinement of Kay Graham. Yet Susie, who still loved Warren and knew he needed domestic structure, eventually triangulated the arrangement.
How did that work?
She allowed Astrid to attend backstage, more intimate social events, while Susie maintained the role of the official wife for public, formal events. It was an arrangement that baffled outsiders, but functioned perfectly for the three people involved, prioritizing Warren's operational needs and emotional comfort over societal norms.
Let's shift now to the enduring core ideas that defined his mature success and legacy, starting with his deep friendship with Charlie Munger and the inversion principle.
Munger was the intellectual sparring partner who helped him evolve beyond the cigar butt philosophy, buying very cheap, often mediocre companies that had one last puff left. Munger's counsel was fundamental to his philosophical development. Invert, always invert.
What does that mean in practical terms, and how did it advance his thinking?
Instead of asking, how do I succeed, they would ask, how do I fail? They constantly pondered the reasons for human and business failure as a way of deducing the path to success. They regarded rationality and honesty as the highest virtues, concluding that quick impulses and self-delusion were the major causes of mistakes in business and life.
So Munger pushed him beyond his natural risk aversion.
He did. He pushed Buffett towards buying great businesses at fair prices, rather than just fair businesses at great prices. It was a huge evolution.
This focus on ethical behavior and honesty brings us to the value of reputation and trust, a lesson ingrained by his father's political struggles.
The key maxim here is Kiewitz, which Buffett adopted. A reputation is like fine china, expensive to acquire, and easily broken. Buffett translated this into his ultimate ethical standard. All decisions should be judged by whether one would want them reported in the Omaha World Herald.
The hometown paper test.
The scrutiny of the hometown paper was the final test.
But the source notes that this ideal sometimes clashed with the secretive nature of his early deal-making. He was trying to protect himself and his assets while still maintaining his reputation.
That tension existed because he needed tactical advantage. For example, he got a waiver from the SEC for Mrs. B's Nebraska Furniture Mart to protect her privacy-keeping, a deal secret to shield a partner. And he kept National American stock in the original shareholders' names to avoid tipping off his father or the market about his moves.
So he was constantly balancing transparency with tactical surprise.
Exactly, the inner scorecard with the rules of the racetrack.
Finally, let's discuss his ultimate philosophical position on luck and wealth, often shared with students. The ovarian lottery. This concept is just essential to understanding his legacy.
This is his mechanism for reconciling his immense, disproportionate wealth with his Midwestern humility and ethical principles. He consistently tells students that his birth being born white, male, American, and wired in a way that paid off disproportionately in this particular society was simply winning the lottery.
It's a profound recognition of how external factors dictated his success, completely outside of his control.
He deliberately contrasted his situation with men he observed in China pulling his boat, who were destined to spend their lives tugging those boats because they didn't have a chance. It was pure luck that we had a shot at the brass ring.
So he views himself as merely the efficient accumulator of capital that society wrongly distributed.
And therefore, he had a moral duty to return it.
And that profound conviction fueled his ultimate plan to give away virtually all his money, leading to the massive donation to the Gates Foundation.
Yes. That donation was the final, monumental act of commitment to letting go of the money he had spent a lifetime grasping and guarding. He was making a statement against dynastic wealth and philanthropic grandiosity. He structured the donation to force the Gates Foundation to spend the money fast, ensuring the snowball continued rolling downhill, but for the benefit of society, not for the creation of perpetual controlling family power.
Looking across this remarkable span of his life, from the Dust Bowl to the dot-com bubble, what stands out is the deep contradiction. The risk-averse man who feared confrontation and public speaking, yet built his career on bold, solitary decisions and absolute non-consensus investing, culminating in standing completely alone against the 1999 tech frenzy.
The core lesson for any learner, for anyone trying to apply this knowledge, is that Buffett's success wasn't just about formulas. Graham's method was just the starting point. It was about intense personality controls. It was the rigidity of the inner scorecard, the psychological defense of the margin of safety, and Munger's inversion principle. He conquered his social fears through systematic effort to become a world-renowned speaker, and he conquered the market's irrationality by sticking rigidly to the principles of caution and value he learned during the economic collapse of his childhood.
Right.
He had the self-contained confidence to be called corked by the market and not care, because his internal metrics confirmed he was right.
That brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. to mull over. We've seen the sheer cost of his singular focus on accumulating wealth and control. Buffett's most candid assessment of success was, basically, when you get to my age, you'll really measure your success in life by how many of the people you want to have love you actually do love you. Was his single-minded obsession with making money the thing that drove away the person who truly anchored him, Susie, an obstacle? Or was it the necessary engine for achieving that ultimate goal of gaining the love and respect he sought?
It's a profound paradox. He built his empire by prioritizing the quantitative over the qualitative, only to discover later in life that the true metric of success is entirely qualitative and emotional. We've seen how his obsession drove away Susie, only for him to desperately try to repair relationships with his children and later integrate Astrid and Susie into his life.
So his life and his wealth
Became an elaborate, decades-long attempt to build the external stability he needed to find the internal love he craved.
This was a fascinating deep dive into the mind and methodology behind the greatest investor of our time. We hope the insights into the inner scorecard and the solitude of contrarianism give you plenty to think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.
And to wrap up, thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and follow up in the next topic.
Okay, welcome back. Today we continue our deep dive into the snowball, and we're really getting into the engine room.
That's the perfect way to put it. We're looking at the critical period that really established the intellectual and emotional architecture for everything that came later.
We're talking about the time when all that incredible success was being forged. The mission today is to examine this period from the early 1950s, right when his intellectual foundation was set at Columbia, all the way through the profound personal and professional shifts that culminated around 1977.
Exactly. It's a huge span. You have the creation of his investment philosophy, the birth and dissolution of his first partnership, and in parallel, this often heartbreaking evolution of his most critical relationship.
His marriage to Susan, or as she became known, Susie Sings.
That's right. And to really get our heads around this, we're going to use a key tool, one that Charlie Munger basically made famous.
Invert, always invert.
You got it. It's the perfect lens. We don't just look at the success. We look at what he was trying so hard to avoid. We study the failures, the psychological blocks.
And the tension in this period is it's incredible. On one hand, you have this intensely rational, calculating mind.
Building this perfect financial machine out in Omaha, far away from the noise of New York City.
But on the other hand, you have this profoundly socially stunted young man. I mean, just paralyzed by self-doubt and desperate for connection.
And he channels all of that massive energy into the one thing he could control, the one thing that was predictable.
Making money.
It's the story of a dual self, really. An intellectual giant, but emotionally still a kid trying to figure out a world that didn't run on numbers.
So let's start at the beginning of that journey, forging the foundation at Columbia.
Well, you have to start with where that intense drive came from. And it wasn't just about getting rich. It was about validation.
Right. As a young guy, he was obsessed with making money. Paper routes, selling gum, pinball machines, all that stuff.
Incredibly profitable stuff, too. But at the same time, he just could not make any headway with girls. And it caused him, profound embarrassment.
I remember that story where he and two friends called 30 different girls and failed to get a single date.
Can you imagine? The mortification was so intense, it took them years to try again. So when that social world failed him, he redirected everything. All that competitive drive went straight into finance.
Because the rules were logical.
Yeah.
The results were clear.
Exactly. And you see this in his academic life, too. He just cruises through Wharton. It took him no effort at all. He became famous for these, obnoxious feats of memory.
Correcting professors on textbook citations, right? Pointing out a missed comma.
Or misquoted footnote.
Yeah.
He'd finish accounting exams while they were still handing them out.
It's a mind just operating at a different speed. But he said himself he was still directionless. He was just making a series of disconnected transactions.
Yeah, he didn't have the why yet. He didn't have the framework. And that all changed with something super mundane.
The Columbia University catalog.
That's it. He's looking for the intellectual cave where the real masters were. And he sees that Ben Graham and David Dodd, the authors of Security Analysis and The Intelligent Investor, are lecturing there.
And that was it. He found it.
He found the key to the whole system. This wasn't just about school. This was about a philosophy. It's where he found the anchor for his entire career. The principle of intrinsic value versus market price.
And the absolute necessity of the margin of safety.
Let's really break that down, because margin of safety is the single most important concept he ever got from Graham. It's not just a rule, it's a philosophy of risk.
It's about protecting yourself.
Totally. Graham saw value investing as this fascinating, all-consuming treasure hunt. You're looking for the true value of a business. The margin of safety meant you had to buy $1 of real, verifiable assets for 50 cents.
So it's not about finding a stock that will double. It's about making sure you can't get wiped out.
That's the core of it. That 50-cent buffer means that even if you're wrong, even if the economy tanks, you have protection. You're shifting the odds dramatically away from a catastrophic mistake.
And he was already applying this kind of thinking, wasn't he? Even before Columbia. The Kaiser-Fraser short sell.
A very sophisticated bet. He and his father shorted it at $5 a share, expecting it to go bankrupt. So he was already comfortable with these complex transactions at a young age.
But not always worldly wise. There was that incident with his grandfather Ernest about splitting a commission.
Yeah, that taught him a hard lesson. Know the deal in advance. He realized that even with family, business had to be governed by clarity and rationality, not just relationships.
And you see that dual reality play out perfectly in his interviews. When he talked stocks, he was a prodigy. People were mesmerized.
But then you get the Harvard Business School interview.
Total failure.
Because they weren't just looking for an analyst. The interviewer was looking for a leader, someone with emotional maturity. And what they saw was, frankly, an emotionally immature 16-year-old with a genius-level intellect in one narrow subject.
That rejection must have just reinforced his idea that he had to do it his own way.
Absolutely. He knew his path had to be independent, based purely on intellectual rigor, not these social games he kept losing.
Which brings us back to his mentor, Ben Graham. What else did he take from him beyond just the numbers?
Graham was a titan. I mean, his performance was just superior. He beat the market by 2.5%, compounded annually for 20 years.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but over 2 decades.
It results in 65% more value. And this is the critical part, with way less risk than the market as a whole. He proved that a methodical, rational approach could beat pure speculation.
But it was Graham's values too, wasn't it?
Paramount. Graham believed rationality and honesty were the highest virtues. He modeled a life where money was a tool, not the goal. Once he had enough to live comfortably, he just didn't care about having more.
A powerful model for young Warren.
Sure. And it's through Graham that he meets Walter Schloss. And he's drawn to Schloss, not just because he worked at Graham Newman, but because of his gritty, disadvantaged background.
It set a pattern, right? This deep respect for self-made success, people who did it themselves through sheer toughness.
Exactly. He admired Schloss's guts. But it's also telling that he didn't risk his own capital with Schloss.
Yeah.
Because even then, it was unthinkable for Warren Buffett to let someone else manage his primary capital.
Okay, so the intellectual foundation is set. It's anchored in Graham's principles. But to understand the relentless drive, we have to look at the emotional side, which really informs his move back to Omaha.
This is where it gets really deep into the psychology. His mother, Layla, is central to the whole story. She was obsessed with what he'd later call the outer scorecard.
What the neighbors think, external validation.
Constantly. And it manifested in these immense, damaging emotional tirades. She instilled this profound sense of worthlessness in both him and his sister Doris.
Which is just devastating.
It left them with lifelong self-doubt in almost every area of their lives, except business. Business became his safe harbor, the one place where he had control, where the results were quantifiable, and where she couldn't take it away from him.
Let's quickly define that scorecard idea. The outer scorecard is worrying about what the world thinks of you. The inner scorecard
is judging yourself by your own internal standards, your own character, your own performance.
And because of his mother, he was basically forced to build an ironclad inner scorecard for his work.
He had to. The only thing that mattered was his own objective analysis, completely independent of public opinion. He couldn't trust the outer scorecard because he'd already been told he was worthless.
And that vulnerability leads directly to the most important person in his life, his wife, Susie Thompson.
Initially, she was totally uninterested. She was in love with someone else. And given his history of social failure, that rejection just plunged him into a terrified state.
Just jittering on the edge of a breakdown.
He felt totally odd, socially inept. But Susie was different. She was sophisticated, authoritative, and emotionally generous. She had this capacity for connections that he just didn't have.
She saw past the numbers guy.
She did. She saw the vulnerable kid underneath and recognized how desperately he needed to be soothed and reassured. The book calls her the sprinkling can who was going to make sure that the flowers grew.
She basically put him together, which allowed him to focus all his intellectual energy on finance without collapsing.
But it wasn't just her. He took these very deliberate steps himself, like enrolling in the Dale Carnegie course.
Which speaks to this almost terrifying focus on self-improvement. It wasn't about charm. It was a practical tool.
It was an essential intervention. He had a paralyzing fear of public speaking. He said he would literally throw up beforehand. This course was about overcoming a career-limiting physical anxiety.
And he didn't just attend, he mastered it. He absorbed it completely, and he even started teaching investing courses himself.
It shows that if he could break a problem down into a system, whether it's value investing or social anxiety, he could master it.
So, armed with Graham's principles and Carnegie's confidence, he makes this truly seismic decision in 1956. He leaves New York City.
To start Buffett Associates, Ltd. In Omaha, I mean, you can't overstate how bold and unconventional that was.
It was defiant.
Totally. In the mid-50s, no serious American money man worked anywhere but New York City. Wall Street ran on proximity, on gossip. To exile yourself to Omaha was a profound statement.
He was declaring that his method was so superior, he didn't need the noise of Wall Street.
And he doubled down on it by renting a house instead of buying one. He famously said he had other plans for his capital.
Pure Buffett. Every dollar had to be working, compounding.
Not sitting idle in a house. His home was his office, and his life was that partnership.
Let's talk about that structure, Buffett Associates.
It was designed for total independence. Started with 7 partners, raised $105,000. Key people were Doc Thompson, Susie's dad, who gave him every penny he had, and his Aunt Alice.
And the compensation structure was key.
A 25% fee on profits, but only above a 6% return hurdle. And he reinvested all his fees. The goal was to become a millionaire by 35, and he structured his entire life to get there as fast as possible.
But the social paradox was still there, right? Even in Omaha.
Oh, yeah. Their social life was him holding forth on stocks or playing the ukulele. He hated small talk and would just flee upstairs to work. And it's important to note, he wasn't reading Proust like Graham. He was obsessively hunting for undervalued assets.
Which brings us to Dempster Mill, a perfect example of Graham's cigar butt, investing in action.
Right. A cigar butt is a failing company that's so cheap there's one last, free, profitable puff left in it. You buy it for less than its liquidation value. Dempster Mill was a classic case. He bought 11% and got on the board.
But this is where his deep, visceral aversion to confrontation really comes to the surface.
It was traumatic for him. He hired a manager, Lee Diamond, even though he had reservations. And when he had to fire him, he dreaded it. He dreaded the potential for an emotional eruption.
It went right back to his mother's rages.
Exactly. The experience was so awful that he realized he had to shut down emotionally to create a shell when faced with that possibility. He vowed to avoid confrontation at all costs from then on.
Which shed so much light on his later management style. He wanted managers who didn't need managing.
It was a business decision, sure, but at its core, it was a profound psychological defense mechanism.
That aversion, ironically, led directly to his biggest mistake, which also became his greatest vehicle. We're talking about Berkshire Hathaway.
The ultimate cigar butt. It started as a classic Graham play. He saw this failing textile mill run by Seabury Stanton. Stanton was pouring money in, trying to modernize, but it was a losing battle. Buffett just saw the liquidation value.
But he didn't just buy it for rational reasons. He bought control out of fury, the 1964 tender offer dispute.
The legendary moment. Stanton offered him $11.38 per share, which was 12.5 cents less than they had agreed on.
A tiny amount of money.
But to Buffett, it was an insult, a betrayal of trust. That fury froze his position. Instead of selling, he started buying aggressively until he had control of the whole company.
So an emotional reaction leads him to own a declining business. And then he's immediately confronted with the thing he hates.
The New Bedford newspaper runs a headline about outside interests taking over. The last thing he wanted was to be branded a ruthless liquidator like a Dempster Mill.
So to protect his reputation, his inner scorecard?
He publicly vowed to keep the business going and avoid mill closings. He saddled himself with this commitment to a dying industry purely to avoid a public fight.
He later called it his #1 mistake, an intellectual compromise driven by emotional avoidance.
But the true genius here wasn't the mill. It was the strategic pivot he made almost immediately after, grafting a financial operation onto this failing skeleton.
The acquisition of National Indemnity in 1967, and the magic concept of float.
First, the timing was perfect. His friend called it the 15 minutes in heat phenomenon. NACCO's owner, Jack Ringwalt, would get so irritated by a claim that he'd want to sell for about 15 minutes every year. Buffett was just waiting for that moment.
So let's really get granular on float. This is the engine of the snowball.
It really is. Insurance companies collect premiums from you today, right? But they don't pay out claims for accidents or fires until much later. That money they're holding in the meantime.
That's the float.
That's the float.
Yeah.
And here's the magic. Buffett gets to invest that money for his own benefit, interest-free.
Most businesses have to borrow money to get capital. This was free capital.
Or sometimes even better than free if they run an underwriting profit. And grafting this onto Berkshire made its capital structure, as the source material says, homeostatic.
Self-regulating.
Exactly. It insulated Berkshire. Even if the textile mills were losing money, he had this steady, compounding stream of investable capital coming in. It was the ultimate leverage point.
At the same time, he and Munger are messing around with blue chip stamps, which was another kind of float business.
A brilliant model. People would collect these trading stamps, but a lot of them would get lost or never be redeemed. So the company got an interest-free loan on that delayed redemption.
But it came with huge legal risk.
Massive. The Justice Department was suing them for being a monopoly in California. And this is where you see Munger's influence growing. He was teaching Buffett that a wonderful business, even with legal headaches, is better than a fair business at a wonderful price.
That focus on complex, risky bets eventually put them in the crosshairs of federal regulators in a really terrifying way.
The SEC investigation into the Wesco deal in the 70s. This is no joke. An aggressive prosecutor recommended filing charges against Buffett and Munger personally.
For market manipulation, essentially.
The SEC believed they intentionally quashed a merger by overpaying for stock. And for Buffett, whose entire inner scorecard was built on honesty, this was soul-shaking. The fear of being branded a liar, a criminal.
He fought it desperately.
He fought that SEC tiger with everything he had. And the episode taught him a huge lesson about avoiding overly complicated deals where his integrity could be questioned.
All this complexity, the SEC heat, it coincided with a big change in the market, didn't it?
Yeah, by the late 60s, the market had dried up. All those cheap cigar butts that Graham's method relied on were just gone. The game was getting harder.
Which led to the great transition of 1969, the dissolution of the partnership.
A piece of brutal rationalism. He knew he couldn't deliver the same spectacular results. He wrote to his partners, lowered his goal to 9% a year, which was still great, but he knew it was a psychological peg down for them.
He was making a market call, basically saying the game wasn't worth playing anymore.
And his partners, they howled with disappointment and a few with fear. I mean, these were school teachers and ministers who trusted him with their life savings.
He felt a huge obligation to them, though.
He did. He didn't just abandon them. He guided them on what to do next. But winding down was the only rational move.
And it left him personally with a lot of cash. He and Susie walked away with about $16 million.
And true to form, that money didn't sit in a bank account. He immediately plowed it back into buying more Berkshire and DRC stock. That cash infusion gave him the firepower to really pivot toward Munger's philosophy.
To move from buying mediocre businesses cheap to buying quality businesses at reasonable prices.
And that intellectual shift was sparked by personal outrage. A Forbes article falsely insinuated he was involved in insider trading.
Which would have just driven him insane.
Absolutely. And that dovetailed perfectly with his growing appreciation for businesses with strong brand names, like media companies, which set the stage for the Washington Post and his incredible friendship with Katharine Graham.
Their first meeting in 1971 was pretty awkward, though.
It was 20 minutes long, and he said they looked like a couple of drowned rats. Kay Graham was incredibly wary. Her Wall Street advisors, guys like Andre Meyer, were whispering in her ear, calling Buffett her new boss, playing on her fears.
So how did he win her over?
He proved his loyalty and integrity during the highest stakes moment of her life, Watergate. The Post was fighting the SEC over its stock structure, and Buffett was her Sir Lancelot, providing unwavering support.
And the moment that sealed it?
She was desperate to maintain control of her family's company. She asked him to look over this critical document about her control structure, and he immediately wrote back, reassuring her that the A shares gave her absolute control. He used that great line.
I'm telling you that even though these teeth look like Little Red Riding Hoods.
It was this profound moment of technical and psychological support that cemented their trust forever.
And that relationship started pulling him into a world of elephant bumping, right? High society.
And he hated it. Kay tried to give him some polish, dragging him to these glamorous parties, but he was profoundly uncomfortable and out of place. He was still that socially anxious kid.
His dining habits in Washington became legendary.
A perfect symbol of his rigidity. Her chef found it impossible to cook for him. He hated anything green. Even at these fancy dinners, he'd just eat a hamburger or a steak. His inner scorecard was fine, but his outer social performance was just awkward.
So while Warren is going through this massive professional transformation from Omaha investor to DC power player, the foundation of his personal life, his marriage to Susie, was slowly starting to crumble.
She was his anchor, truly. During those high-growth years, she was the one putting him together, raising the kids, providing the soothing presence he needed. Warren, meanwhile, was just this silent, disengaged presence, his nose always in an annual report.
But Susie was this incredible person in her own right, with her own passions, deeply committed to activism.
Her focus was on civil rights, on desegregating housing in Omaha. She was working in the messy human world of social reform, the very world Warren always fled from.
And she was a giver, almost to a fault.
Staggeringly so. She hosted a hospice in their apartment for a friend dying of AIDS. And there's this telling detail that when she was hospitalized from exhaustion, the family seemed strangely unperturbed. Her self-sacrifice had just become normalized.
By the mid-70s, she needed an outlet that was just for her, and she found it in singing.
In 1976, she starts performing at this little lounge in Omaha, singing these torchy old standards like "Send in the Clowns." It was this genuine public emotional opening for her, a way to find an identity outside of being Mrs. Warren Buffett.
She was vamping and flirting and romancing her audience, and Warren's reaction to this is so telling.
He's standing in the back, arms crossed, watching her, and he remarks, "This is pretty good of me to let her do this."
He saw her fulfillment through the lens of his own permission.
He just couldn't see her need for an identity separate from his needs. And her friends saw the inevitable result. She had created a separate life for herself within her marriage. His real marriage was to Berkshire Hathaway.
And his intense new connection with Kay Graham basically pushed Susie off the stage.
Which led to the emotional collapse of 1977. She became panicked. She was seen sobbing in a friend's doorway right next to Warren's office. And critically, she started stashing small amounts of money with friends.
A desperate sign she was preparing to escape.
And in late 1977, she went to San Francisco for what was supposed to be a few weeks and just stayed. She effectively left him.
Her reasoning was just devastatingly honest.
She needed freedom. She needed to find her own identity outside the constant, thankless job of managing him. She needed to stop being the sprinkling can and grow her own flowers.
And Warren's reaction?
Total shock. Absolute devastation. He genuinely had no idea. He was shattered. He wandered aimlessly, had a raging headache, was calling her every day, weeping. He said he would have done anything. Moved to California, learned to dance, but it was too late.
The void she left was filled with her blessing by Astrid Minks,
which created one of the most unique domestic arrangements imaginable. Astrid was the opposite of Susie. 16 years younger, blue-collar, and so frugal she made Warren look like a spendthrift. She was a homebody.
She provided the domestic stability Susie had, but without the competing intellectual and social demands.
Exactly. And the arrangement that followed, Susie remaining his wife and closest confidant from a distance, while Astrid served as his practical companion at home, it allowed Warren to maintain his intense, single-minded focus on business, almost completely unburdened.
And as this personal drama is reaching its climax in 1977, he's simultaneously pulling off one of his most important professional rescues ever.
The timing is incredible. The Geico rescue. The company he first bought stock in back at Columbia was on the brink of bankruptcy.
And the guy he brought in to save it, Jack Byrne, was everything Buffett wasn't.
Byrne was ruthless, confrontational. He demanded massive rate increases, non-renewed 400,000 policies. He was the manager Buffett needed, precisely because he had the traits Buffett lacked.
There was that incredible moment in New Jersey.
The defining moment. Byrne is arguing with the insurance commissioner, gets fed up, and just threatens to throw his license on the table. He says, "Here's your fucking license, I'm done."
That audacity was exactly what Geico needed.
Buffett and Byrne rescued the company, and it became a cornerstone of Berkshire. It affirmed his new principle: bet on trust and bet on strong, decisive management. It was the final piece of the intellectual shift, happening right in the middle of his deepest personal crisis.
So when we look back at this whole period, this intense 25-year span, what does it all mean for you, the learner?
You're witnessing this incredible duality, the financial genius mastering Graham's principles and building this fortress afloat, while at the same time grappling with immense personal insecurity, and the painful consequences of his singular focus.
The transformation was total. He was forced to evolve, right? From just finding these cigar butt stocks to adopting Munger's view of betting on great management and great brands like Geico and the Washington Post.
And that evolution wasn't just intellectual. It was spurred by the shock of having to deal with the real world, catalyzed by Susie's life and her eventual departure. By 1977, the framework was set.
But his personal life settled into this incredibly unusual arrangement. The post-1977 solution, with Susie as his wife and confidant and Astrid as his practical home companion, allowed him to continue his intense focus on compounding money.
Virtually unburdened by the normal complexities of marriage.
Which leads us to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with.
How much of the extraordinary scale of the Snowball's later success, the massive wealth that we see today, was owed to that highly unusual but functional, emotional, and practical support system that was shocked into existence in 1977.
It was only after that personal reckoning that he was truly free to remain utterly fixed on business for the next 5 decades.
An incredible story. A tumultuous and truly defining period.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us for this detailed deep dive into the architecture of compounding. If you enjoyed this analysis and got some new insights, we'd really appreciate it if you'd like, share, and subscribe. We'll be sure to follow up on the next phase of this incredible story in our future analysis. Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to come back to continue the snowball and really dive deep into the next major stage of this investor's journey.
Yeah.
We've moved far past those formative years, the initial partnerships, the quiet build of the 70s.
Right.
We're focusing now on this explosive period from the late 80s all the way through the dot-com era.
A huge chunk of time.
It is. And it's when he really solidifies his reputation as the king of Wall Street, a corporate savior, and then transitions into this ultimate role as a public sage and philanthropist.
And that transition is just everything, isn't it? Because it forces this jarring contrast on you. I mean, our sources, especially those covering chapters 43 through 62, they just perfectly showcase the glamour of, say, the 1999 Sun Valley Conference.
Oh, yeah, the Gulfstream jets and all that.
Exactly. Gulfstreams and foie gras juxtaposed against the grim reality of a collapsing financial house or a devastating personal crisis.
It's two different worlds colliding.
Totally. So, our mission here is to synthesize decades of this high-stakes corporate drama, deep personal change, and, his foundational investment philosophy. We're drawing specifically from the King of Wall Street and claim check sections. We're really looking at how a reputation is earned, lost, and then rebuilt in that crucible of public crisis. And maybe most importantly, the ultimate kind of surprising purpose of accumulating that much capital.
Yeah, it's the moment his deeply personal life just crashes into his immense professional power on a global scale. Today, we'll cover everything from managing that Wall Street crisis at Salomon Brothers,
where his integrity was the only thing that mattered.
The only commodity, and then navigating the just irrational euphoria of the dot-com bubble as the one contrarian voice in the room.
The skunk at the garden party.
Totally. And then we'll get into the major life changes involving his family and his evolving, very public and often provocative thoughts on succession, the ovarian lottery, and what he saw coming years before the rest of the world even had a clue.
It's going to be a lot to unpack.
Let's start with the high-stakes corporate maneuvering that really defined the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, this signaled a massive shift in the scale of his capital.
Right.
And the first blockbuster move we have to analyze is Coca-Cola. Starting in 1988, Berkshire began this colossal investment in KO.
It was huge, almost $600 million.
Which quickly grew to $1.2 billion, representing over 6% of the company by 1989. And this wasn't just a big buy. It was done with, extreme, almost unprecedented stealth.
Well, that stealth wasn't just, a preference. It was financially essential.
Because he moved markets.
His actions now instantly moved global markets. The sheer size of this commitment was so immense and his reputation so powerful that the investment actually needed a special dispensation from the SEC to delay public disclosure for a whole year.
The whole year.
Think about that. The government agreed that if the market knew what this one specific investor was buying, the price would just skyrocket, making the massive accumulation impossible at a rational price.
So he's not just a great investor anymore. He's operating outside the normal rules.
Exactly. He's operating outside the normal rules of market disclosure because of his sheer influence.
And what's so interesting is how the reception from Koch's leadership was so different from his earlier, sometimes hostile corporate raids.
Oh, coldly different.
The CEO, Roberto Goizueta, wasn't just pleased, he was delighted.
It was a validation. This wasn't a threat. It was the ultimate seal of approval. He immediately asked Buffett to join the board, which placed him in, as our sources describe it, the absolute highest echelons of corporate America.
And that board seat solidified his shift, right? From this shrewd outsider to an institutional insider.
The sage, the presence that signaled undeniable long-term value. And this privileged access, in turn, completely shaped a new phase of his investing strategy. Because as that traditional feeding territory for great undervalued public stock started to dry up,
the market had caught on.
The market had wised up to the classic value play. So CEOs, who were facing potential hostile takeovers, began approaching him directly with special deals.
Wait, okay, but these special deals, they sound like they could attract troubled companies looking for a quick cash infusion. How did he make sure these weren't just, toxic liabilities in disguise?
That's the heart of the risk management. This is where we see the rise of the convertible preferred stocks.
Okay, so not common stock.
Right. These weren't common stock, which carries pure market risk. They were these hybrid structures purchased in companies like Champion US Air.
A purchase he later famously regretted.
Oh, big time. He cited it as a huge error. And also Gillette. But what made these so attractive was the built-in protection against the downside.
And that protection was key, the high floor.
Exactly. These deals offered a guaranteed high-yield return, usually around 9% annually, paid out quarterly, while still retaining the massive upside potential.
Because he had the conversion rights.
He held the conversion rights. It was pure Buffett, guaranteeing current income to make the investment safe, so that even if the business just stalled for a decade, that 9% return made it a winner. But if the company succeeded wildly, he could convert and participate fully in that explosive growth.
It just shows how, as his capital swelled, the structure of the deal, the risk mitigation became just as important as the quality of the business itself.
Avoiding major loss was always priority number one.
And if we're talking about structuring foundational investments, we have to look back at Geico. That's where the focus on management quality paid off decades later.
It's the perfect case study. Berkshire had been a large investor since the 70s, but the eventual full acquisition in the mid-90s is one of the best examples of corporate crisis control and leadership you can find.
It's hard to believe now, but in the mid-70s, Geico was basically bankrupt.
On the brink.
So what kind of drastic measures did Jack Byrne, the guy he hired to rescue it, have to take?
The measures weren't just drastic. They were the definition of a scorched earth strategy. And it was completely the opposite of Buffett's own non-confrontational nature.
Right.
Byrne had to cut deep and fast to stop the hemorrhage. This meant non-renewing policies for 400,000 customers.
400,000.
Yeah, often the riskiest ones. And giving up licenses in entire states, like Massachusetts, where the regulations were just too high.
And our sources detail the sheer chaos this created inside the company. Employees, hearing that huge parts of the business were being jettisoned, were physically throwing files and policies out of the top story windows.
Yes, literally throwing policies into the Omaha street. Byrne later estimated it cost the company $30 to $40 million in excess claims because they lost the data they needed to track liability.
That's unbelievable.
That's how profound the desperation and the breakdown were. But those agonizing, painful steps were what saved the company and stabilized the balance sheet.
So, fast forward to the mid-90s. The push for full acquisition is driven by the CEO, Tony Nicely, who would rather work for a stable, long-term owner like Berkshire than deal with Wall Street analysts.
Makes sense?
But the negotiation for full ownership dragged on for over a year. And here we see him use a technique he called the circular saw.
That phrase sounds intimidating, especially for his usual folksy style.
It does.
So the circular saw wasn't really a power move in the traditional sense. It was more subtle, a kind of psychological devaluation to drive down the purchase price.
So how did he use it against a loyal partner like Nicely?
Well, Buffett argued that the emerging high-tech internet stuff was going to hurt the auto insurance industry. Specifically, he said it would narrow Geico's core competitive advantage, their low-cost, direct-to-consumer model.
So he was basically telling them their business was about to be worth less because of technology.
Exactly. And therefore, the purchase price should reflect that coming reality.
And here's the ultimate irony, isn't it? At this point, before most people even had dial-up, Buffett, the world's most famous tech skeptic, had a better, clearer, decade-ahead grasp of the internet's disruptive impact on that industry than almost anyone else in the room.
It's the ultimate paradox of his circle of competence. His skepticism wasn't about being a Luddite. It was rooted in profound insight. He used that technological knowledge defensively, not offensively.
So he didn't invest in the tech winners.
No, but he used the certainty of tech's disruptive force to lower the price on a predictable, traditional business. He got an excellent price for Geico, which of course soon became one of Berkshire's most foundational subsidiaries.
That era of measured investment was completely overshadowed, though, in 1991 when the Salomon brothers crisis just forced him out of Omaha and into the center of Wall Street's most cutthroat environment.
Yeah, that was a whole other level of intensity.
Let's look at that drama, because it put his own reputation and billions of Berkshire's capital directly on the line. Salomon, under CEO John Gutfreund, was the king of Wall Street. It was known for its long knives culture and just intensely aggressive traders.
The environment was absolutely cutthroat. It was all fueled by high-stakes trading, particularly in the lucrative but extremely risky Treasury bond market. And Salomon's dominance wasn't based on superior analysis. It was based on aggressive, boundary-pushing market tactics.
Specifically, couping auctions.
Exactly.
What exactly did that involve, and why was it market manipulation?
So Treasury rules limit how much of a new bond issue any single entity can buy. Coupling was the practice of systematically exceeding that limit, buying up to half of an entire auction issue across multiple unauthorized accounts to artificially inflate prices.
And the goal was to squeeze short sellers.
The ultimate goal was to squeeze the shorts, who were betting on falling prices. By controlling the supply, Salomon could force them to buy back the bonds at inflated prices. It sent Salomon's profits soaring and just fueled that toxic testosterone-heavy culture.
The crisis really triggered when a trader, Paul Moser, made unauthorized false bids in Treasury auctions, including a key one in May of '91. But the critical failure wasn't Moser's, was it? It was Gutfreund's immediate failure to disclose.
Precisely. Gutfreund knew about the earlier false bids but failed to tell the authorities. Instead of coming clean immediately, he just offered this generic promise to cooperate over the broader squeeze issue. That failure to act, keeping it internal, was a fatal mistake.
When Buffett realized the true scope of the crisis, he was on vacation in Virginia City, Nevada.
Of all places.
He calls in, finds the stock is down 5%, but he feels this terrifying lack of urgency from Salomon's leadership. He quickly realized it involved much more fundamental lying and cheating than what was being reported.
And his response was immediate and definitive. He flew in, took command, delayed the press release until he had a handle on the true facts, and then assumed the role of interim chairman after Gutfreund was finally forced to resign.
It's just such a remarkable shift. I mean, this is a man who hated confrontation, actively avoided Wall Street, and suddenly he's running the most cutthroat, high-wire financial firm in the world.
Right. And his first order of business was radical honesty.
Total, immediate confession.
He thought in these stark black and white terms about honesty. He famously said there was no option of forgiveness for lying. The turmoil that followed was terrifying for the firm. The stock plunged, their vital debt financing just vanished overnight, and investment banking clients were canceling deals left and right.
The firm was on the brink of collapse.
Facing extinction. And despite this external catastrophe, our sources paint a picture of this intense internal psychological pressure on him.
Right, while he was internally roiling in turmoil, he maintained this eggshell-smooth demeanor in public.
The detail about him playing an electronic game called Monty for hours at a time in his office, just to distract himself from the potential collapse, it's so telling. It's the ultimate picture of emotional self-control under the greatest professional stress.
He knew he had to appear utterly stable.
Completely in control, because the fate of the company rested entirely on the world believing he was running it. If he showed even a flicker of panic, the firm would be finished.
And then came the critical long-term decision, picking the next leader. He couldn't afford to be wrong. His method was brilliantly simple, but it revealed so much about his values.
Yeah, he interviewed all the major candidates for CEO and asked them the same question. Who should be the next CEO, Salomon?
He wasn't looking for self-promotion.
No, he was looking for honesty and perspective. He needed total trust in his foxhole, someone who prioritized the firm's survival and integrity over their own personal ambition. And that test immediately revealed the character of the candidates, which led him to Derek Maughan.
This whole episode just highlights that profound contrast that Wall Street couldn't grasp. Here's this folksy Midwestern sage who sits figuratively on a front porch with a glass of lemonade.
And tells humorous homilies, yeah.
But at the same time, he's running the most ruthless, complicated firm on the planet, navigating these regulatory minefields.
The world wanted him to fit into a neat box, either a financier or a philosopher. But he showed he was both. His management philosophy at Salomon was really just applying Midwestern principles of radical honesty and common sense to the hyper-complex, morally ambiguous world of high finance. And that, more than any complex trading strategy, is what saved Salomon.
The intensity of that crisis eventually gave way to the intensity of the dot-com bubble. By the late 90s, the snowball had grown so vast that Buffett found himself, increasingly thrust onto the global stage, often as the sole voice of caution against this unprecedented market excess.
And the ultimate stage for that clash of philosophies was the 1999 Sun Valley Conference.
Sun Valley, Idaho, the Allen & Co. Conference.
Yeah, the ultimate elephant-bumping gathering. An event where you simply cannot buy one's way in. It was a faux democracy of the elite.
So everyone arrives in their Gulfstream 4 jets. They put on the mandated Western gear.
And they all congregate by the duck pond to ask for wisdom from Bill Gates or Andy Grove.
The atmosphere must have just been thick with euphoria and self-importance. The Dow had burst 10,000 just 4 months before. Everyone there felt recently enriched.
Except maybe for the man from Omaha. He delivered this carefully constructed warning, designed not to be dismissive, but to force them to think rationally about valuation and history.
And he used his classic analogies, right, including that famous line about the airline industry.
The one about Kitty Hawk.
Yeah.
Yes. He famously said, "I really like to think that if I had been down there at Kitty Hawk, I would have been far-sighted enough and public-spirited enough to have shot Orville down."
That's a darkly humorous way of saying the entire history of the industry has been a value destroyer. But why that specific anecdote for this audience?
Because the audience was full of VCs and CEOs building the infrastructure for the next generation of transport, the internet. He was reminding them that creating a revolutionary technology flight, or the internet, does not automatically guarantee long-term profitability for the investors.
Too much capital, too much competition.
The capital outlay is too high, competition is too fierce, and the barriers to entry eventually fall. He then made his point brutally clear with a direct valuation contrast.
Comparing the old economy to the new?
He contrasted Toys R Us, an established business earning $400 million a year on $11 billion in sales, with the rising star eToys, which was losing $123 million a year on only $100 million in sales.
And the market cap of eToys was?
Utterly irrational. He was asking them to justify the valuation disparity using classic business metrics, which, of course, they couldn't.
And he drove the point home with the cartoon slide from that legendary 1940s book, Where Are the Customers' Yachts?
Yes. He projected the cartoon and delivered that famously provocative line. There are certain things that cannot be adequately explained to a virgin, either by words or pictures.
The implication being?
The implication was clear. These internet investors were financially naive and about to get screwed by the market's excesses.
And the response was just stony silence. Nobody laughed.
It was a total rejection of reality. They were so deep in the delusion of perpetual growth and the idea that this time is different that they just couldn't acknowledge the terrifying truth. He was challenging the core delusion of the entire highly enriched room, and they just refused to engage.
The only laugh he got was when he turned the attention away from the market to the superficial glamour of the attendees themselves.
Exactly. He joked about the gift he was handing out at Jeweler's Loop and suggested they use it not for valuation analysis, but to look at one another's wives' rings, the third wives especially.
And that got a laugh.
That crass personal jab about divorce and excess surprisingly got the laugh. It just reveals so much about the priorities of that room. They would rather laugh at a personal insult about status than acknowledge the terrifying fundamental truth about the economic train wreck he predicted was coming.
Now, despite his profound skepticism toward technology as an investment, Buffett had one of the most famous and unlikely friendships in the tech world with Bill Gates.
Yeah, which began over a 4th of July weekend in 1991, orchestrated by Kay Graham.
The pairing was a total cultural oddity. Buffett was initially reluctant, right? He compared computers to Brussels sprouts.
Something unpleasant he'd rather avoid. He just didn't immediately get the world Gates inhabited.
But the icebreaker was surprisingly human and low-tech.
The hilarious no TP story. During that weekend, Buffett was using the gas station restroom down the road because he was too polite to ask about the plumbing in the house.
No way.
Yeah. A guest eventually figured out that the note in the bathroom that said no TP stood for touchy plumbing, not no toilet paper. It was this human moment that broke the barrier between the financier and the technologist.
But the real connection, the professional bridge application, was the game of bridge itself.
Right. His friend Sharon Osberg introduced him to playing bridge on a computer. And that demonstrated the critical point about tech adoption that he articulated so perfectly.
And what he said was...
He said, you sell the computer first to people who are interested in computers. And then you sell it to people like me who don't give a damn about computers.
So is it fair to say that his public tech skepticism wasn't about being a Luddite, but was actually a profound insight into how the application, not the hardware, would drive true long-term economic value?
Absolutely. That is the key distinction for his circle of competence. He didn't avoid the benefits of technology. He used the internet to lower the price on Geico, after all. What he avoided were the highly competitive, rapidly evolving businesses where predicting the future winner required technical foresight he didn't have.
So he maintained his margin of safety.
By sticking to businesses with an enduring, understandable moat. And he readily acknowledged the cost of this principle-driven approach.
He admitted that if he'd invested in Microsoft and Intel when he first met Gates, he might have remained #1 on the rich list.
Right, instead of Gates. But the critical point is that he openly accepted being second or third because he valued avoiding excess risk more than he valued the highest possible short-term financial ranking. He understood the life cycle of many tech businesses was short and brutal. He preferred certainty.
The public success of this era happened against the backdrop of profound, decade-spanning personal change, starting much earlier in 1977 with Susie's departure from their home.
And that was the culmination of his singular, crushing obsession with business, which essentially pushed her offstage.
Susie felt an intense need for freedom and identity outside of being the wife of this investing phenomenon.
Her own passions were being stifled. So she moves to San Francisco. But what makes the story so unique is that their relationship didn't end. It just changed. It continued in this highly emotional, codependent, but functionally separated way.
And Warren's immediate personal reaction to her physical absence was devastating.
It shattered him. Our sources detail his intense struggle. He was barely able to feed and clothe himself, wandering aimlessly in Omaha, suffering from these raging headaches.
It's a physical manifestation of the stress.
Totally. And it only subsided when he was forced back to work. He realized with this crushing force that his singular obsession had caused him to miss out on truly knowing his children. The jokes about him not recognizing his own son were suddenly a painful emotional reality.
This emotional dependency on Susie, plus her absence, necessitated this new living arrangement.
Yeah. They stayed married. They were profoundly close, talking on the phone daily, sometimes with Warren weeping, but he got a companion, Astrid Manx.
Astrid was 16 years younger, blue-collar, and deliberately established a persona that was the total antithesis of the society women like Kay Graham or even Susie.
She's described as hyper-parsimonious, a specialist in haute cuisine and antique bargain hunting, a dedicated homebody, making Warren look like a wastrel in comparison.
So she became this vital grounding force.
The stabilizing force. And this arrangement, a platonic, codependent marriage supported by a functional companion, was co-signed by Susie. It allowed Warren to stabilize his chaotic home life without abandoning that profound emotional connection he still had with his wife.
In terms of business succession, the ultimate expression of his evolving values came in 1992. He invited his son, Howie, who hadn't finished college and was more interested in agriculture, to join the Berkshire board as the future non-executive chairman.
It was a highly counterintuitive and pivotal move, a testament to his values. Howie's role was never meant to be managerial or analytical. It was purely to steward the Berkshire culture after Warren was gone.
To make sure the ethos remained intact.
The honesty, the simplicity, the long-term rational thinking. He was stating clearly that he trusted his son's character and principles above traditional financial credentials to protect the unique soul of the company. It was culture over pedigree.
As the Snowball continued its relentless growth, his public role definitively shifted from crisis manager to, really, a philosophical king. He started using his immense platform to critique the very system that had created his wealth.
And he often used these memorable fables when speaking to students and shareholders to explain his views on wealth and meritocracy.
Like the genie fable.
Right. He'd tell students, imagine you're 16 and a genie offers you any car. but it's the only car you'll ever have. You would take meticulous care of it, right? Protect the paint, change the oil. He applied that to life itself, urging them to take the same meticulous care of their minds and bodies.
But the central concept defining his philosophy of success, the core belief, is the ovarian lottery.
He maintained that his staggering success was almost entirely pure luck. He won the lottery by being born in the United States in 1930, a time and place of immense economic growth, and being wired in a way that paid off disproportionately in this specific capitalistic society.
He believed his talents would have been irrelevant elsewhere.
Largely irrelevant. And that worldview profoundly challenges the American narrative of pure meritocracy, the idea that success is achieved solely through hard work.
Which led directly to his attitude toward wealth itself, which he called claim checks on societal resources.
Exactly. He viewed massive accumulated wealth as just a claim on the resources of society, the roads, the police, the legal system, which he didn't personally build.
And he found the idea of passing these claim checks to heirs deeply troubling.
Fundamentally counterproductive. He noted the irony of country club members talking about the debilitating effects of poverty while simultaneously enabling their descendants to inherit fortunes, allowing them to consume far more than they personally have produced.
So he argued against dynastic wealth.
Forcefully, saying it turns a meritocracy upside down by letting descendants, rather than those who excel, allocate society's resources.
And this belief system is what directly fueled his involvement in the political debate around the estate tax.
Correct. He argued that the tax on investment capital was unfairly low compared to the income tax paid by people who actually work, like his secretary. He saw the estate tax as the only mechanism to recycle those claim checks back into the system that created them.
And he didn't just talk about it. He took early, concrete steps toward loosening his fist decades before the huge gift.
The 1981 Berkshire Charity Program is a perfect example. Since Berkshire didn't pay a dividend, he set up a program where the company would contribute $2 per share to a charity chosen directly by the shareholder.
So it was decentralized giving.
Fostering a sense of shared responsibility, and it had nearly 100% participation.
Now we have to pivot back to the corporate maneuvers, specifically the major acquisition of General Ray in 1998. This was a massive $22 billion deal.
And it wasn't just a stock purchase. It fundamentally changed the profile of Berkshire Hathaway.
How so?
Well, it was a calculated portfolio allocation change. Berkshire's stocks, including the treasured Coca-Cola, were suddenly swamped in this massive ocean of bonds. It shifted the whole company toward insurance and away from pure equity investment. And General Re was supposed to be a paragon of discipline.
And the acquisition immediately went sideways, almost spectacularly.
Within the first 12 months, General Re suffered unprecedented underwriting losses, nearly $1.5 billion.
$1.5 billion.
For a company that prided itself on being the ultimate risk manager, that loss was a staggering, unheard-of blow to both the reputation and the balance sheet.
So what was the internal fallout? How did he respond?
It caused significant anxiety, mainly for his reputation. He wasn't just worried about the capital, he was worried about appearing foolish. His reaction was classic anxiety management. He immediately sought escape hatches.
Hedging the risk.
He started instinctively hedging by funding the competitors of General Re through his reinsurance protege, Ajit Jain, and through Lloyd's of London. He was trying to hedge the liability that had now been thrust upon his reputation.
This era also saw him and Munger become increasingly vocal critics of market excess, particularly derivatives.
They saw it as this massive, opaque, systemic risk building up in the financial system. Munger made that blunt, prophetic statement: "I'll be amazed if we don't have some kind of significant blow-up in the next 5 to 10 years.
Years before 2008.
Years before. And Buffett provided the iconic, terrifying label, calling complex derivatives like CDSs and CDOs financial weapons of mass destruction.
And what those instruments did was create the illusion of no-risk lending.
They allowed lenders to package up risky mortgages and sell the risk off to someone else. Because the risk was theoretically distributed globally, banks felt free to lend recklessly. But the risk wasn't eliminated, it was just hidden and leveraged.
And critics, especially those making fortunes in that market, used his label to suggest he was just old-fashioned.
He doesn't understand modern finance. But his critique was simple. These things masked the underlying exposure to bad debt and created systemic fragility. The issue wasn't the math, it was the lack of accountability.
His critique of corporate governance also extended to basic accountability with auditors. He insisted on simple, common-sense questions.
Deceptively simple questions designed to put auditors on the spot. Things like, if the auditor were in charge, would the company follow the exact same internal audit procedures? Or, did the auditor know about anything the company had done to change the timing of when sales or costs were reported?
Questions designed to cut through financial engineering and get straight to management's intent.
Precisely. They focused on intent and ethical behavior, not just GAAP compliance. And a lot of companies copied those questions to mitigate their own liability.
We transition now into the final years of the Snowball's accumulation, marked by the inevitable market crash and profound personal tragedy for him, forcing the ultimate decision about his legacy.
Yeah, the NASDAQ collapse of 2000 signaled the end of the dot-com era. The index cratered 31% in a few months.
And this financial chaos coincided with a personal health crisis, passing a kidney stone just before the shareholder meeting.
A painful confluence. He was rushed to the hospital at 3 in the morning in intense agony. But even then, he maintained his typical demeanor, telling callers things were never better.
But the profound emotional blow, the real confrontation with mortality, came with the death of his close friend Kay Graham in 2001.
She was at Sun Valley, 84 years old, feeling worn out but having a marvelous time, when she suffered a fatal fall. The fallout for Warren was immense. He retreated to his condo, initially suppressing the grief.
But the dam eventually broke.
A week later, he finally allowed himself to grieve. Our sources describe him crying on the phone, great gulping sobs, choking, gasping cries. He had a tendency to think about the world, and even himself, in the third person. This grief was undeniably in the first person.
And that forced him to confront his own mortality.
And, critically, the unfinished business of succession and his ultimate legacy.
That sense of mortality was just deepened by the next devastating ordeal, Susie's oral cancer diagnosis in San Francisco in October 2003.
The diagnosis was brutal, a 50% chance of surviving 5 years. The medical demands were horrific, potentially disfiguring surgery that would remove parts of her jaw and most of her teeth, leaving her unable to talk or sing for over a month.
So how did Warren, the man who had struggled so much with emotional closeness that she'd left him, how did he respond?
Total, unequivocal commitment. He flew out immediately, knowing he had to give her the presence and support he knew she would have given him. It highlights the profound complexity of their relationship.
They couldn't live together and they couldn't live without each other.
Exactly. They were married in everything but residence, and she was the only person who truly understood the price of his singular focus.
And the recovery was intense for him as well.
During her radiation treatment, he became deeply involved, even impatient with the schedule interruptions over the holidays. He spent hours convincing her not to stop treatment. This painful period lasted until July 2004, when Susie suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died.
And that was the ultimate catalyst for his final decision about legacy.
It crystallized everything he believed about the ovarian lottery and claim checks. Following a suggestion from his friend Sharon Osberg, he decided to give away almost all his money, tens of billions of dollars. Not to a foundation of his own, but primarily to the Gates Foundation and his children's foundations.
And the stipulation was crucial. The money had to be spent quickly, no perpetual foundations.
He believed money should be put to work now by those with demonstrated ability. The gift was also strategically designed to train his children in philanthropy before the sluice of billions arrived after his death.
And this decision cemented his philosophical evolution, didn't it? He offered students his ultimate metric for life's worth.
His profound statement was, "When you get to my age, you'll really measure your success in life by how many of the people you want to have love you actually do love you." It's this fundamentally humanist measure, focusing on earned personal affection rather than accumulated capital.
Finally, we arrive at the period just before the Great Recession, where his contrarian warnings about the credit market went from philosophical to terrifyingly real, and he'd recognized the signs much, much earlier.
Absolutely. The bankruptcies of Oakwood Homes and Conseco in 2002 were the initial tremors. This insight led to a classic Buffett move. He acquired Clayton Homes, a manufactured housing company, in 2003.
Why acquire a housing company when credit was tightening?
He was using Berkshire's immense low cost of funds as a competitive advantage. When credit was tightening for everyone else, Berkshire could still lend to manufactured home buyers at better rates. He was capitalizing on market fear.
His market advice post-dot-com was so prescient because it was just common sense. He reminded investors that trees don't grow to the sky.
And he offered Erbstein's maxim as his guide. Anything that can't go on forever will end. It sounds obvious, but during the credit bubble, people truly believed it could go on indefinitely.
And Munger's warning was equally stark. predicting a 4% return world.
And warning against the scams that would pop up as people desperately tried to turn 4% into 16% through increasingly risky schemes, the exact temptation that led to the proliferation of CDOs.
The systemic failure they predicted arrived in March 2008 with the run on Bear Stearns. It mirrored the Salomon crisis, but the scale was just vastly different.
This time, the Fed intervened directly, guaranteeing $30 billion of Bear Stearns' debt, bailing out a major investment bank for the first time. Buffett immediately noted that this was the 1998 long-term capital management bailout played in a much larger and more frightening governmental scale.
It has been a remarkable deep dive into how knowledge and capital accumulate and the ultimate decisions about legacy. We've watched the snowball grow so large that it forced the man behind it to become a corporate savior and a public philosopher.
Bound by this implacable adherence to honesty and long-term rational thinking.
Whether he was buying Coke or saving Salomon.
What stands out is how his success, the huge snowball, forced him into the spotlight, making his intensely private choices and his investment principles the ultimate test of his character. He faced market excesses and personal loss, yet remained that consistent voice of clarity.
The greatest paradox is that the man who avoided risk above all else, whose focus was so singular it risked his closest relationships, became the person the world relied on for clarity during its most complex, frightening crises.
It's true.
The final provocative thought we want to leave you with is the ovarian lottery. Despite his unique wiring for the financial world, which he acknowledged was pure luck, he used his skills not to build a dynasty, but to address systemic global issues.
Proving that the ultimate purpose of accumulating capital isn't consumption or status, but the highly rational, highly efficient process of giving it away to solve the world's most intractable problems.
We appreciate you joining us for this analysis and exploration. We hope this has given you plenty to think about until our next deep dive. And on behalf of our team, thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, follow up in next part.